Join us on Patreon and become part of our journey to uncover history's untold stories. Your support helps us create in-depth content, bring hidden narratives to life, and keep history alive for everyone. In the vibrant heart of Harlem during the early 20th century, a neighborhood alive with the sounds of jazz, the ferment of social revolution, and the spiritual revival of a people in search of self, an unlikely yet captivating religious movement quietly took root. Born out of the dreams and dissatisfactions of the African diaspora, this movement would dare to rewrite spiritual lineage, reinterpret sacred texts, and reimagine Black identity through the lens of ancient Hebrew heritage. At the center of this religious reawakening stood a man whose vision was as bold as it was controversial, Rabbi Wentworth Arthur Matthew. In the shadow of towering Christian churches and amidst the rising tide of Pan-Africanism, Matthew and his congregation, the Commandment Keepers, offered something radically different, a call to return not merely to Africa, but to Zion, not just politically, but spiritually. Born in St. Kitts in the British West Indies around 1892, Wentworth Arthur Matthew arrived in the United States during the early waves of Caribbean migration that helped reshape New York's Black cultural and intellectual life. Like many other Black immigrants of the era, Matthew encountered a society stratified by race and marked by rigid religious and social hierarchies. But unlike most, he envisioned a religious identity that refused to be boxed in by Christian orthodoxy or the white-dominated Jewish establishment. Drawing upon the Black Israelite tradition, an interpretive lineage that claimed African Americans were descendants of the ancient Israelites, Matthew constructed a theology that placed Black people not on the margins of biblical history, but at its very center. In 1919, he established the Commandment Keepers Ethiopian Hebrew Congregation of the Living God Pillar and Ground of Truth Incorporated in Harlem. The name itself is a rich tapestry of biblical reference, Afrocentric pride, and deep theological intent. The group's identification as Ethiopian Hebrews was no mere flourish. It was part of a broader Afrocentric theology which held that the original Hebrews were Black and that the true chosen people of the Bible had been scattered across the African diaspora, lost to history by slavery and colonialism. Matthew's teachings thus served both a spiritual and a psychological function. They uplifted a population whose identity had been historically degraded, giving them a divine history that challenged both white supremacy and religious exclusion. The Commandment Keepers were deeply influenced by traditional Jewish practice. They kept kosher, observed the Sabbath on Saturday, wore talitot and yarmulkes, and used Hebrew in their liturgy. However, their syncretism was unmistakable. Services blended Hebraic prayers with African American religious music, and teachings frequently referenced Black liberation theology alongside Torah exegesis. Matthew himself took on the title of rabbi, although he was not ordained through mainstream Jewish institutions. This self-ordination and reinterpretation of Jewish identity would become a flashpoint for criticism and controversy, both within the Jewish world and beyond it. What made Matthew and the Commandment Keepers so unique was their unwavering insistence on being both authentically Jewish and authentically Black, not as two separate identities to be balanced, but as one unified heritage to be reclaimed. Matthew rejected the notion that Jewishness was solely defined by lineage or European rabbinical approval. In his theology, Jewish identity was spiritual and historical, not racial. He taught that Black people, particularly African Americans, were the true descendants of the biblical Israelites. This assertion flew in the face of the prevailing Eurocentric Jewish narrative and was often met with skepticism or outright hostility from mainstream Jewish communities, who saw the Commandment Keepers as imitators or fringe eccentrics rather than co-religionists. Despite the marginalization, Matthew persisted. He opened a yeshiva to educate young Black Hebrews in Torah and Hebrew. He ordained rabbis, trained scribes, and emphasized the importance of religious literacy. His synagogue on West 123rd Street became a sanctuary for those disillusioned with traditional churches and seeking a deeper connection to both their African roots and sacred scripture. He traveled across the country, spreading his message and establishing affiliated congregations in cities like Philadelphia and Chicago. He even sought diplomatic recognition from the State of Israel, though unsuccessfully. One of the most enduring aspects of Rabbi Matthew's work was his approach to Hebrew identity not as a borrowed tradition, but as an inheritance unjustly denied. This ideological foundation resonated strongly during the Harlem Renaissance and the subsequent civil rights movement.
Eras marked by a growing hunger among Black Americans to reclaim historical agency and spiritual dignity. Matthew's teachings, while controversial, reflected the same intellectual and cultural ferment that animated figures like Marcus Garvey, W.E.B. Du Bois, and later Malcolm X. But unlike Garvey, who called for a return to Africa, Matthew called for a return to Torah. Unlike Du Bois, who sought equality through intellectual rigor, Matthew sought redemption through ritual observance and divine covenant. By the 1960s, however, Matthew's influence began to wane. Mainstream Jewish institutions continued to reject his movement, and younger generations of Black Jews and Israelites often diverged from his doctrinal path. Some turned toward messianic beliefs, embracing Jesus as a Black Messiah, while others adopted more radical political ideologies that eclipsed spiritual concerns. The commandment keepers remained, but fractured into smaller groups, each carrying forward some aspect of Matthew's vision, though often with diverging interpretations. Still, Rabbi Wentworth Arthur Matthew's legacy endures, not merely as a religious innovator, but as a pioneer of Black spiritual reclamation. He died in 1973, but the seeds he planted have grown into a diverse forest of Black Hebrew congregations, Messianic assemblies, and Israelite communities spread across the United States, the Caribbean, Africa, and even Israel itself. Some have embraced more orthodox Jewish practice. Others have taken a more nationalist or Afrocentric path. Yet all, in some way, carry the imprint of the man who once preached in the storefront synagogues of Harlem that the children of Israel were not lost. They were simply waking up. In an age where questions of race, religion, and identity continue to reverberate with renewed urgency, Rabbi Matthew's work offers a compelling, if complicated, testament to the power of faith to redefine self and society. He imagined a world where Blackness and Jewishness were not oppositional, but intertwined, where Scripture could be a map not to escape history, but to reclaim it. His story, and that of the commandment keepers, reminds us that religious history is never static. It is always in motion, shaped by those bold enough to see themselves not as strangers to holy texts, but as their rightful heirs.